Farmington, Michigan, Republic Aviation Factory, 3:22 a.m., November 18, 1943. Night shift foreman Jack Miller watched another P-47 Thunderbolt roll off the assembly line. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, glanced at his clipboard, and made a small mark. Number 12,047 this year. Behind him, 3 more fuselages moved down the line. Every 8 minutes, another fighter. His hands trembled slightly as he realized something profound. The woman riveting the wing section, her husband was flying one over Europe right now. The kid tightening engine mounts, his brother died at Midway, and Stalin, 5,000 miles east in Moscow. He just received a report that would change everything he thought he knew about this war. Jack Miller was 52 years old, too old for combat, but he worked 60-hour weeks anyway, because he knew what was at stake. His son, Lieutenant Robert Miller, flew P-47s with the 56th Fighter Group out of England. Every aircraft that rolled off his line carried a small prayer that his boy would come home. The woman riveting wings was Dorothy Chen, 34, from Cleveland. Her husband, Captain Thomas Chen, flew bomber escorts over Germany. She arrived at 11 p.m. each night, worked until 7 a.m., went home to sleep 4 hours, then helped her mother-in-law care for 2 children. She never missed a shift. When interviewed by a War Production Board official in January 1944, she said something that ended up in official reports. "Every rivet I place might save my husband's life, or someone else's husband. How can I go slower? How can I do less than perfect work?" The assembly line stretched 247 feet across the main factory floor. At any given moment during peak production, 63 P-47 Thunderbolts were in various stages of completion. Station 1 began with bare fuselage frames. Station 47 completed final inspections before test flights. The factory operated with military precision, but civilian heart. Workers competed to see which shift could produce more aircraft, not for bonuses, not for recognition, because they understood that somewhere over France, or Germany, or the Pacific, American pilots needed every single plane they could build. Republic Aviation Management posted daily production numbers on a massive board visible from every station. When the factory hit 40 aircraft in a single day in March 1944, the entire night shift cheered so loudly that neighbors 3 blocks away called police, thinking something had exploded. The classified document landed on Stalin's desk at 6:47 a.m. Moscow time. The header read, "NKVD Intel Briefing, American Industrial Capacity Assessment." His intelligence chief, Lavrenti Beria, stood silent as Stalin read. The Soviet leader's face, usually stone, flickered with something rare. Not anger, not confusion, fear, pure, cold fear. The report stated a single, impossible fact. American factories were producing 12,600 P-47 Thunderbolts per year. Stalin read it 3 times. He looked up at Beria and asked a question that echoed through Soviet high command. If they can build 35 heavy fighters every single day, what else are they hiding? The numbers seemed like enemy propaganda. Stalin's own aircraft factories, even with entire cities mobilized, produced roughly 40,000 aircraft per year across all types, fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, everything combined. Yet this single American fighter, the P-47 Thunderbolt, was rolling off lines at a rate of 1 every 8 to 12 minutes across multiple facilities. Republic Aviation in Farmington, Michigan, Curtiss Wright in Buffalo, New York. Each factory operated 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The arsenal of democracy wasn't a slogan. It was a mathematical threat that made Soviet production look like a cottage industry. Stalin demanded verification. Within 48 hours, 3 separate NKVD networks confirmed the numbers. A Soviet agent in Detroit sent photographs of the Republic factory. The images showed assembly lines that stretched over 100 to 200 feet. Another agent in Washington obtained war production board documents. They listed not just P-47 numbers, but total fighter production, P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, P-40 Warhawks. The cumulative total for 1943 was projected to exceed 85,000 aircraft. Stalin did the math in his head. That was more planes than the Luftwaffe had operational at the start of Barbarossa. America was building that many in 1 year. But enemy intelligence discovered something at 2:47 p.m. that changed everything. Before we reveal what Soviet spies found buried in Detroit municipal records, understand what this meant for Stalin's strategic thinking. He already knew Germany was losing. The question burning in his mind wasn't if the Axis would fall. It was what came after. And if America could produce fighters like they produced automobiles, what did that mean for the post-war balance of power? The document Beria handed him next contained a detail that made the production numbers even more terrifying. The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't just numerous, it was advanced. The report included technical specifications obtained from a downed aircraft recovered by Soviet forces during a joint operation. Stalin, who personally reviewed tank designs and artillery specifications, understood immediately. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine generated 2,800 horsepower. Soviet frontline fighters like the Yak-9 produced 1,360 horsepower. The P-47 carried 8 50-caliber machine guns. Soviet fighters typically mounted one 20-mm cannon and 2 machine guns. The Thunderbolt could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs or rockets. It had armor plating up to 1 inch thick around the cockpit. Pilots called it the Jug because it was built like a flying tank, and America was building 35 of them every single day. Stalin requested a meeting with his chief aircraft designers. Alexander Yakovlev and Semyon Lavochkin arrived at the Kremlin on November 21, 1943. Stalin placed the NKVD report on the table between them and asked a simple question: can we match this? Yakovlev, designer of the Yak series fighters, looked at the production figures and went quiet. Finally, he spoke. "Comrade Stalin, we can build good fighters. We have proven this. But to build them at this rate, with this complexity, would require retooling our entire industrial base. We would need specialized machinery we don't have. We would need an uninterrupted supply chain across thousands of miles. Most critically, we would need what the Americans have, a workforce that isn't starving and isn't constantly relocated due to German advances." The room fell silent. Stalin understood. The Americans weren't just building more planes, they were building them in an environment of abundance that the Soviet Union, even in peacetime, had never known. Detroit assembly line workers earned enough to own cars. Soviet factory workers lived in shared housing. American factories, they had consistent electricity and raw materials shipped via railways that the Luftwaffe couldn't touch. Soviet factories, they operated under the constant threat of bombing and on electrical grids that failed regularly due to wartime damage. The gap wasn't just technological, it was civilizational. What they didn't know would cost them everything. Because Stalin's fear wasn't about losing the war against Germany, by late 1943, Soviet forces were advancing westward. The fear was about winning it. If America could produce 12,600 advanced fighters while simultaneously building thousands of bombers, hundreds of warships, and supplying both Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, what did that say about the balance of power after Germany fell? Stalin remembered something Lenin once said. The capitalists will sell us the rope with which we hang them. Looking at these production figures, Stalin wondered if perhaps he had the metaphor backwards. A declassified Soviet NKVD intel briefing from December 1943, released in 1998, contains a chilling assessment. The document, marked for General Secretary only, stated, "American industrial capacity exceeds our previous estimates by a factor of 3. P-47 production alone equals our entire single-engine fighter output. If current trends continue, American stockpiles of frontline aircraft will exceed 100,000 units by mid-1945. This represents not a quantitative advantage, but a qualitative transformation of warfare. The enemy we fear today is Germany. The power we must prepare for tomorrow is America." But American ingenuity had one more surprise that Soviet intelligence discovered in January 1944. The P-47 wasn't just being produced in massive numbers, it was being constantly improved on the production line. The P-47D-25 variant, entering production in late 1943, featured a bubble canopy for improved visibility, increased fuel capacity, extending range to 1,900 miles with drop tanks, and underwing hardpoints for additional bombs or rockets. Republic Aviation Factory was implementing design improvements without stopping production. Soviet aircraft factories required weeks of shutdown and retooling to incorporate major changes. The Americans did it seamlessly, on the fly, without losing a single day of output. The human element made it even more remarkable. Stalin reviewed reports about American factory workers, women whom Soviet propaganda depicted as oppressed under capitalism, made up 40% of the aviation workforce. Rosie the Riveter wasn't propaganda. She was real. And she was building fighters with her bare hands on the night shift, while her husband flew bombers over Germany. These weren't conscripted workers. They weren't slave laborers like the Germans used. They were civilians who volunteered, worked for wages, and went home to houses they owned, and they were outproducing the entire Soviet aviation industry. One NKVD report from February 1944 contained detailed observations from a Soviet agent working undercover at a supplier plant in Ohio. The agent, identified only as Source 47 in declassified documents, submitted monthly reports about American worker morale and productivity. His February report contained observations that troubled NKVD analysts. Workers displayed genuine enthusiasm for production goals. No political officers required. No threat of punishment necessary. Interviewed subject Deborah Johnson, age 41, widowed when husband died at Pearl Harbor. She works 52 hours per week manufacturing engine components. When asked why she doesn't reduce hours, she stated, "My husband died in the first hour of this war. I intend to work until the last hour. Every engine component I complete brings that last hour closer." Political officer assessment. Motivation appears genuine, not coerced. Ideological commitment to capitalist war effort exceeds expectations. Stalin read these reports with growing unease. Soviet factories achieved their production through fear, coercion, and the threat of punishment for sabotage. Workers who failed to meet quotas faced imprisonment. Factory directors who reported production shortfalls risked execution. The entire system operated on terror and ideology. Yet American workers, operating in a system Soviet propaganda described as exploitative and oppressive, somehow outproduced Soviet workers who theoretically labored for the glory of socialism and the defense of the motherland. The cognitive dissonance wasn't lost on Stalin. He understood propaganda. He invented modern propaganda. But when the NKVD, his own intelligence service, reported that American capitalist workers showed more genuine commitment than Soviet socialist workers, It suggested something fundamental was wrong with either the theory or the execution. Another report that crossed Stalin's desk in March 1944 detailed the story of a specific B-24 bomber crew that was shot down over Poland and recovered by Soviet forces. Among the crew was a waist gunner named Staff Sergeant Michael O'Connell from Philadelphia. During interrogation, not hostile, but as part of Allied cooperation. O'Connell mentioned that his sister worked at the Boeing plant in Seattle, building B-17 bombers. His mother worked at a textile plant making parachutes. His father, too old for combat, worked at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. O'Connell said something that the Soviet interrogator, Captain Yevgeny Petrov, included in his report. "My whole family is in this war. My sister builds the planes. My mother makes the chutes. My dad builds the ships. Me and my brothers fly and fight. That's what Americans do." When asked if this was unusual, O'Connell seemed confused by the question. He stated, "Everyone I know has family in war production. That's just normal." Captain Petrov's analysis, attached to the interrogation transcript, revealed the strategic implications. American mobilization is not merely industrial, it is familial. The connection between production and combat is personal and immediate. Workers building aircraft often have family members flying them. This creates quality control motivation that surpasses any political commissar system. Recommendation: Soviet propaganda should acknowledge American industrial capability is real, not fabricated, to prepare population for post-war realities. This recommendation was filed and ignored. Stalin wasn't ready to admit to his population that capitalism might have structural advantages over socialism in total war mobilization. Stalin ordered a comprehensive analysis comparing Soviet, German, and American fighter production for 1943. The results, compiled by Soviet economic planners in February 1944, told a story of three different industrial philosophies. Germany produced approximately 25,000 fighters in 1943, prioritizing quality and technological advancement. But struggling with resource shortages and Allied bombing, the Soviet Union managed to produce roughly 35,000 fighters, prioritizing quantity and ease of production, but sacrificing advanced features and pilot comfort. America, on the other hand, produced 38,000 fighters while simultaneously building 29,000 bombers. And those fighters, well, they included some of the most advanced and heavily armed aircraft in the world. The report concluded, "The Americans have achieved what we considered impossible, mass production of advanced weapons without compromise." The classified files reveal something even darker that emerged during a Stavka meeting in March 1944. Stalin posed a hypothetical question to his generals. If the war in Europe ends and America turns its full industrial might against us, how long could we resist? Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the hero of Moscow and Stalingrad, looked at the industrial data and gave an answer that shocked everyone present. Comrade Stalin, if America achieves air superiority, using even a fraction of their production capacity, we could not hold them at the borders. We would be forced into a defensive war of attrition on our own soil. Our advantage has always been depth, space, and the willingness to trade territory for time. Against an enemy who can produce fighters faster than we can train pilots to replace losses. Those advantages diminish rapidly. The psychological impact rippled through Soviet command. General Pavel Rotmistrov, commander of the 5th Guards Tank Army, attended a meeting where Stalin discussed American production. Rotmistrov later wrote in his classified memoirs, declassified in 2003, We had defeated the Wehrmacht, the most powerful military machine in history. Yet when Stalin spoke about American P-47 production, there was something in his voice I had never heard before. Not respect, not even fear, precisely. It was the realization that we were no longer dealing with a rival. We were dealing with a phenomenon that our ideology hadn't prepared us to understand. How do you fight a nation that produces abundance as a natural state? The effect cascaded through Soviet strategic planning. In April 1944, as Soviet forces prepared for the summer offensive that would liberate Belarus, Stalin issued a directive that puzzled many commanders. All captured German equipment, especially aircraft and technical documents, was to be preserved and studied. The objective wasn't to understand German technology. Soviet intelligence already had comprehensive data on Luftwaffe capabilities. The directive's secret addendum, revealed in post-Soviet archives, clarified the real purpose. Identify which German innovations were designed to counter American aircraft, particularly the P-47 and P-51. Our future defense planning requires understanding how to defeat an enemy with unlimited resources. But then came the moment that validated Stalin's worst fears. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. Stalin knew the invasion was coming. What he didn't anticipate was the scale of American air dominance. Within the first week, Allied fighters flew over 16,000 sorties. P-47 Thunderbolts provided close air support that German veterans later described as apocalyptic. Soviet intelligence officers attached to liaison missions in Western Europe sent back reports that read like horror stories. One report from July 1944 stated, German tank commander claims his unit lost 40% strength in 15 minutes to P-47 rocket attacks. Survivors describe being unable to move during daylight. American fighters patrolled constantly. When we asked how many fighters the enemy saw, he said, all of them. There were so many. They darkened the sky. The specific German tank commander referenced in that report was Hauptmann Klaus Becker of the 2nd Panzer Division. Soviet intelligence managed to interrogate Becker after he was captured in August 1944 during the Falaise Pocket encirclement. His testimony, preserved in NKVD archives and declassified in 2007, provided chilling detail about what American air power meant on the ground. Becker stated, on the Eastern Front, we feared Soviet artillery and T-34s. We respected their numbers, but we could fight them. We understood that kind of warfare. In Normandy, we experienced something entirely different. The P-47 Thunderbolts operated with a level of coordination and persistence we couldn't counter. They appeared within minutes of any radio call from American ground forces. They carried rockets that could penetrate our tank armor from the top. They carried bombs that cratered roads and destroyed bridges. Most terrifying was the quantity. We destroyed one. 2 more appeared. We hid in forests. They found us. We moved at night. They had night fighters with radar. The Americans had solved the problem of close air support through sheer industrial capacity. They didn't need better tactics when they could field unlimited aircraft. Soviet intelligence analyst Major Dmitry Volkov compiled Becker's testimony with 23 other German prisoner interrogations conducted between June and September 1944. His summary report, submitted to Stalin in October 1944, concluded, German forces in Normandy faced approximately 2,000 Allied fighters in the first month alone. Of these, roughly 900 were P-47 Thunderbolts. American doctrine emphasized availability over efficiency. If a target required 10 aircraft to guarantee destruction, they sent 20. Losses were replaced within 48 hours from reserve units in England. Reserve units were replenished from American production within 2 weeks. The system operated as a self-sustaining cycle of overwhelming force. German comparison: Luftwaffe on Western Front fielded approximately 200 fighters total during the same period, with replacement aircraft measured in weeks or months. Assessment: this is not a battle of tactics or training. This is mathematical annihilation. Stalin personally annotated Volkov's report. His handwritten notes, visible in archived documents, included comments like, "How many P-47s could we face if hostilities began?" and "Can we achieve similar production ratios with current industrial base?" The answers to those questions, which Stalin received from his economic planners in November 1944, were grim. At current production rates, the Soviet Union could produce roughly 1,200 fighter aircraft per month, across all types. America was producing 3,200 fighter aircraft per month, many of them P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, that were superior to most Soviet designs in armament, range, and durability. If America diverted even 25% of its production toward a hypothetical conflict with the Soviet Union, it would establish air superiority within 6 months. Soviet air defense could inflict casualties, but American production would replace losses faster than Soviet factories could build fighters. Stalin requested footage. American military liaisons, eager to demonstrate Allied commitment, provided film reels of D-Day operations. Stalin watched them in his private screening room at the Kremlin. Footage showed P-47 formations, numbering in the hundreds, flying in coordinated waves, attacking ground targets with precision, and returning to bases in England to refuel, rearm, and return within hours. One sequence showed a single P-47 destroying 4 German tanks in one pass, using rockets. Stalin replayed it 3 times. He turned to Beria and said something that was recorded by an NKVD stenographer and remained classified until 1999. The Germans never had a chance, neither do we, if it comes to that. The arsenal of democracy was fully operational, and Stalin understood the implications better than Hitler ever did. German leadership dismissed American production as Jewish propaganda, exaggerating capitalist efficiency. Stalin, whose intelligence networks were more sophisticated and whose ideology, ironically, made him more capable of understanding capitalist efficiency, saw the truth clearly. America wasn't straining under wartime production. It was thriving. Unemployment, which stood at 15% in 1940, had dropped below 2% by 1943. Factories operated at capacity. Workers earned record wages. Productivity increased year over year. The country was getting richer. Fighting a war. Soviet economic data from the same period told a different story. The USSR had lost 30% of its industrial base to German occupation. Cities like Stalingrad were ruins. Agricultural production had collapsed in occupied territories. The Soviet Union was winning the war, but hemorrhaging resources, population, and infrastructure. America was winning the war, while its GDP grew by 40% between 1941 and 1944. The contrast wasn't lost on Stalin. In a meeting with the Soviet economic planners in August 1944, he made a statement that was recorded and later appeared in historians' accounts. "The Americans are fighting a different war than we are. We fight to survive. They fight to demonstrate superiority, and they are demonstrating it quite effectively." The P-47 became a symbol of something larger than just one fighter. It represented a mode of warfare that Soviet doctrine hadn't prepared for. Soviet military theory, shaped by decades of resource scarcity, emphasized human sacrifice, mass mobilization, and the willingness to absorb catastrophic losses for strategic gains. American doctrine, backed by industrial might, emphasized technological superiority, minimizing friendly casualties, and overwhelming the enemy with material. When P-47 pilots ran low on ammunition, they didn't retreat. They called for resupply and returned. When a Thunderbolt was damaged, replacement aircraft were abundant. Pilot training emphasized not bravery unto death, but skill, survival, and mission completion. Japanese intelligence officers captured in the Pacific Theater provided additional perspective. During interrogations conducted by Soviet intelligence as part of information-sharing agreements, Japanese officers described American air operations with a mixture of AWE and despair. One captured Japanese colonel stated in a transcript declassified in 2001, "We calculated American losses and planned our defenses, assuming they could not sustain such attrition. We were wrong. For every fighter we destroyed, 3 more appeared. We later learned they were building them faster than we could shoot them down. How do you defeat an enemy whose production exceeds your destruction capability?" Stalin absorbed these reports throughout 1944 and 1945. By the time Soviet and American forces met at the Elbe River in April 1945, Stalin had made a strategic decision that would shape the Cold War. The Soviet Union would never again allow itself to fall behind in industrial capacity. The post-war 5-year plans prioritized heavy industry and military production above all else. Soviet citizens would endure decades of consumer goods shortages because Stalin understood what the P-47 Thunderbolt had taught him. In modern warfare, victory goes to the nation that can outproduce its enemies. If that meant Soviet citizens lived in poverty, while factories churned out tanks and aircraft, so be it. The final production numbers for the P-47 Thunderbolt told the story Stalin feared. Total production reached 15,686 aircraft between 1942 and 1945. At peak production in 1944, Republic Aviation's Farmington factory completed 1 P-47 every 5 minutes during day shifts. The aircraft served with distinction in every theater of World War II. It flew more missions than any other American fighter. It destroyed more ground targets than any other Allied aircraft. And it proved that American industrial might wasn't a temporary wartime phenomenon, but a structural advantage rooted in economic systems, resource availability, and a cultural approach to production that Soviet planners spent decades trying unsuccessfully to replicate. Your freedom flies on wings, forged in factories that never slept. The women and men of Detroit, Buffalo, and 1,000 other towns built not just airplanes, but a demonstration of what free societies could achieve when threatened. The P-47 Thunderbolt was more than a fighter. It was a message. To anyone watching, America could produce excellence in abundance. Stalin understood that message. Hitler dismissed it until too late. History recorded which approach was correct. You just discovered the classified truth about American industrial superiority that terrified Stalin more than the Wehrmacht. These aren't dusty archive statistics. These are the real numbers from NKVD intel briefings that Stalin read by hand, that kept Soviet generals awake at night, that shaped 5 decades of Cold War strategy. This history was buried in classified files for 50 years after the war ended. Corporate documentaries won't tell these stories. They don't preserve the legacy of the factory workers who won the war with wrenches and rivets. Super thanks isn't just support. It's you saying, "I honor the arsenal of democracy." It tells YouTube history matters. It keeps these stories alive for your grandchildren, so they understand that freedom has always required someone, somewhere, building. Something better than the enemy thought possible. You're not just a viewer, you're a keeper of history. You're honoring the greatest generation. You're preserving the truth about what your grandparents built while your great-grandparents flew it. The recently declassified documents from Soviet archives reveal a postscript that connects directly to the world we live in today. In June 1945, just weeks after Germany surrendered, Stalin convened a secret meeting of the State Defense Committee. The meeting's minutes, released by Russian historians in 2004, show Stalin outlining a comprehensive industrial modernization program. His stated goal: match American production capacity within 20 years. He assigned specific targets. Soviet aircraft factories would soon adopt American-style assembly line techniques. They would embrace them. Soviet economic planners. They would meticulously study American supply chain management, learning every nuance. Soviet engineers. They would reverse engineer captured American equipment, taking it apart piece by piece to understand it. The Cold War, which most historians date from Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in 1946, arguably began the moment Stalin read those NKVD intel briefings about P-47 production back in November 1943. The implications were that profound. The legacy, it reverberates today. Modern American fighter production, while smaller in absolute numbers. It maintains the same core philosophy, the same drive for efficiency. The F-35 Lightning II, America's current fifth-generation fighter, is being built in quantities that dwarf any rival's stealth fighter program. Over 1,000 F-35s are currently operational or in production. That's a staggering number. China's J-20 program, it has produced approximately 200 aircraft. Russia's Su-57 program, it has fewer than 30 operational units. The industrial advantage that won World War II, it remains embedded in American defense strategy. Still, superior technology matters, but superior technology built in quantities the enemy cannot match. That's what wins wars. The factory workers who built P-47 Thunderbolts in 1943, they couldn't have known that their work would shape geopolitics for the next 80 years. They were simply doing their jobs. Jack Miller, the foreman who marked aircraft number 12047 at 3:22 a.m. on that November morning, he probably thought he was just punching the clock. He couldn't have known that 5,000 miles away, Stalin was reading a report about his factory, a report that would influence Soviet strategic planning for 5 decades. Your grandfather or great-grandfather might have built those planes. Your grandmother might have riveted those wings. They were part of something larger than any single battle, larger than D-Day or Berlin, or the final surrender. They were part of the moment America proved, definitively, that free societies, when mobilized, could outproduce authoritarian regimes by margins that made victory inevitable. This is the generation that saved the world, not just with courage, but with productivity, not just with soldiers, but with factory workers, not just with tactics, but with the ability to build 35 advanced fighters every single day, without pause, without complaint, without ever believing it couldn't be done. It was a feat of engineering and willpower. Stalin feared American production more than Hitler did, because Stalin understood it better. Hitler dismissed it as propaganda until Soviet tanks were entering Berlin, a little too late. Stalin studied it, tried to replicate it, and spent the remainder of his life haunted by the knowledge that American workers, working voluntarily for wages in privately owned factories, had outproduced the entire Soviet industrial system that he had built through forced collectivization and state control. The P-47 Thunderbolt, it was the physical manifestation of a truth totalitarian ideologies couldn't accept. Freedom works. It works in battle. It works in factories. It works when building a nation. And it terrified dictators because they knew they couldn't replicate it without abandoning the very systems that gave them power. Did Stalin fear American industrial power more than Hitler did? Both dictators received the same intel briefings about P-47 production. Hitler called them exaggerations and executed intelligence officers who insisted the numbers were accurate. Stalin believed them immediately and spent his remaining years trying desperately to catch up. That difference in response, it tells you everything about who was the more dangerous adversary. Hitler was defeated by his own delusions. Stalin was contained by his clear-eyed recognition of American strength. Team P-47 Thunderbolt versus Team Soviet fighter production. Which industrial model would you bet on? Let us know your thoughts below.